Committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time, and without objection, all members shall have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional material to the chair for inclusion in the record. A quorum being present, we will now proceed to today's business. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement. Welcome, everyone, to another markup of the House Financial Services Committee. Great to be focused on policy here. Today, we'll consider a slate of fintech, housing, and national security legislation. Before we dive in, I'd like to explain how we ended up with only 5 bills. As we all are aware, 12 pieces of legislation were originally noticed for this markup. Due to the circumstances out of our control, the floor schedule was changed to make today the last day of legislative business this week. Interesting because, we just got here today. So, such as it is. This significantly reduced the time we have for today's markup. And I want to be cognizant of member schedules that after we vote on the House floor, they will likely depart for more charitable climates, mainly their districts. I remind my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that neither I nor the ranking member controls the floor schedule, though if we did, things would be much better. My plan is to have the committee vote about an hour before floor votes are called. We can vote. What we can vote on depends entirely on the speed and efficiency of our debate. I know we all have priorities we'd like to see this committee move. I, of course, am no exception. It's unfortunate that the schedule forced us to truncate this markup, but an announcement on consideration of the remaining bills is forthcoming. So let's get started. Like most of our markups this Congress, several of the bills under consideration today are bipartisan. First, we'll advance a bipartisan resolution led by Congressman Flood and Nickel to overturn the SEC's Staff Accounting Bulletin 121. After Chair Gensler tried to tuck a major policy change into so-called staff guidance, the GAO ruled SAB 121 constitutes a rule. So now our committee is taking action to rescind this misguided rule and ensure Americans can custody digital assets in one of the safest ways possible, through highly regulated banks. Second, we will consider legislation out of the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee. We'll advance 2 bills, led by Congressman Lawler and Congresswoman Cruz, to bring much-needed accountability and transparency to HUD. Congressman Lawler's bill would require, for the first time, the HUD Secretary to testify before this committee annually. This would bring HUD on par with most of the agency heads under our jurisdiction. Similarly, Congresswoman Cruz's legislation will require HUD's Inspector General to testify every year. For an agency with more than $77 billion in budget authority and more than 9,000 employees, these basic oversight requirements should be no-brainers. Both changes will help the agency and this committee function better. They will also ensure HUD is appropriately utilizing taxpayer resources. If we're serious about prioritizing HUD and housing, both bills should be universally supported. That's my hope. Next, we'll consider a measure from Congressman Fitzgerald to hold bad actors accountable for abusing our financial system for illicit purposes. The Bipartisan Combating Money Laundering and Cybercrime Act will ensure the Secret Service has the tools to investigate any and all money laundering crimes. This includes money laundering involving digital assets or cybercrime. Finally, we'll mark up Ranking Member Waters' Wildfire Insurance Coverage Study Act. I appreciate all of our members' engagement here and the ranking member's important work on this subject matter in her home state, but also across the country is highly important. I look forward to a thoughtful debate and thoughtful solutions that we're trying to address here in the committee. I'll close by reiterating what I've said at every markup this Congress. My door is always open. If there's an issue that interests you or a problem you want to address, come talk to me. I can't guarantee a successful outcome or that we'll always agree. However, where we can, we'll look to find common ground, and I'm committed to finding solutions. I look forward to today's debate, and I yield back. I'll now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Waters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Today, this committee is marking up 5 bills, including my bill, as you just mentioned, the Wildfire Insurance Coverage Study Act. Climate change is making wildfires much more devastating and deadly, including in my home state of California, and unfortunately, right now in Texas and Oklahoma, where whole communities are being destroyed by wildfires. At the same time, insurance companies are declining coverage, and while I understand that insurance companies cannot calculate the cost of potential of these disasters, I believe that Congress needs to think about what we need to do to help prepare and protect families and small businesses. However, once again, Mr. Chairman, we're on the brink of another government shutdown that could block federal support to Americans. Today, we will once again vote to kick the can down the road one more week and be forced to watch for another week as the utter dysfunction of the Republican House majority further undermines stability in our democracy and puts our nation's consumers and economy at great risk. And in this committee, we're also going to consider a resolution that will put our economy at risk by gutting the SEC's ability to protect investors and clear up confusion for industry. This resolution would rescind SEC Staff Accounting Bulletin 121 or SAB 121. This bulletin is non-binding SEC staff guidance intended to help clarify how a company should account for its customers' cryptocurrency. We often hear Republicans and the crypto industry complain about a lack of clarity from the SEC, but ironically, the resolution before us effectively blocks the SEC staff from providing that clarity around crypto. What's more, Republicans are proposing bills that prove that they're all talk when it comes to combating our nation's worsening affordable housing and homelessness crisis. I'm deeply disappointed that while over 653 people experience homelessness every night and millions more are just one crisis away from becoming homeless, the only solution Republicans have is to require the HUD Secretary and the Inspector General to testify annually. Time and time again, Republicans have proven that they would rather point the finger at everyone else than put forward serious legislation to address the crisis themselves. In fact, their abysmal report on housing proves this. For example, so far, the only housing bill they have moved since being in the majority is a bill that makes home ownership more expensive. In comparison, last Congress, under my leadership as chair, we passed 12 housing bills into law. These laws help millions of people find housing, remain stably housed, and avoid eviction and foreclosure. But more is needed. If my colleagues are serious about solving this crisis, like they say they are, then this committee should move immediately to consider the 3 pieces of legislation I and my Democratic colleagues have introduced, including the Housing Crisis Response Act, the Ending Homelessness Act, and the Down Payment Toward Equity Act. Together, these bills represent the single largest and most comprehensive investment in fair and affordable housing in the United States history, and will finally make housing a reality for everyone. In fact, many of the provisions in these bills respond to requests made by Republican witnesses during a field hearing in Mr. Lawyer's district last week, including to fund more housing choice vouchers and provide incentives to private developers who build fair and affordable housing. The time is now to work together to do what our communities sent us here to do. With that, I yield back.
Pursuant to notice, I call up H.J. Res. 109, a resolution providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 of the United States Code of the rules submitted by the Securities and Exchange Commission related to Staff Accounting Bulletin number 121, introduced by the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Flood. The clerk will report the resolution, which was distributed in advance.
H.J. Res. 109, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 United States Code of the rules submitted.
Without objection, the resolution is considered as read. The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Flood, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Joint Resolution 109 is a Congressional Review Act resolution that would rescind the SEC's Staff Accounting Bulletin 121. I want to thank my colleague on the other side of the aisle, Congressman Nickel from North Carolina, for his leadership on this issue, as well as Senator Loomis, who is leading this effort in the United States Senate. For those who are not familiar, SOB 121 was guidance released by the SEC in March of 2022. Staff accounting bulletins are technical accounting guidance, not something we'd usually spend a lot of time debating during a committee markup. However, SOB 121 is different. It directs covered entities that custody digital assets to do so on balance sheet. The problem is that for banks, custodial assets are always considered off balance sheet for any other asset, like securities. The ramifications of requiring banks to hold these assets on balance sheet are pretty significant. If a bank were to custody digital assets according to the parameters of SOB 121, the on-balance sheet treatment would affect their other regulatory obligations like their capital and liquidity requirements. The end result is that banks must choose to either custody digital assets, thus inflating their balance sheet and severely affecting every other line of business, or stay entirely out of the market. That's not much of a choice at all. In effect, SOB 121 precludes banks from taking custody of digital assets altogether. Now, I'm sure there are a number of banks that don't have any interest in taking custody of digital assets right now anyway, that aside. But this SOB 121 prevents banks from effectively ever playing a custodial role for these assets. You're locking out the most regulated institutions from a market they know well, which is custody. There are some serious ramifications that stem from that. In January, the SEC approved 11 spot Bitcoin ETFs. These ETFs are giving a lot more retail investors the ability to invest in Bitcoin. Because of SOB 121, banks aren't able to serve as custodians for the Bitcoin within those ETFs. The lack of bank custodians for Bitcoin ETFs is particularly important because holding private keys to Bitcoin is akin to carrying physical cash. Both are bearer instruments, which means the holder of the asset is presumed to be in full control. That's a situation where you might want more bank custodians who are well-regulated experts on custody, on the job. As it is, there are only 4 total custodians for those 11 Bitcoin ETFs, and they are all non-banks. Think about that. Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to submit 2 items describing this issue as it relates to Bitcoin ETFs. One is a joint op-ed on this topic from myself and Congressman Nickel, and the other is a letter from the American Bankers Association.
Without objection.
So how did we get to this point? Unfortunately, there were some serious problems with the process around SOB 121 and how it was issued. The SEC issued SOB 121 without conferring with the prudential regulators who are the experts on regulating bank custody. That's a pretty significant oversight. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell once said in front of the Senate Banking Committee that, quote, bank custody assets are off balance sheet, always have been, end quote. Had the SEC discussed this issue with the prudential regulators before issuing the bulletin, we might have avoided the situation we find ourselves in today. Number 2, the Government Accountability Office determined last year that SOB 121 actually meets the definition of a rule for purposes of the Congressional Rule Act. This means that according to the independent and nonpartisan GAO, SOB 121 is not really non-binding guidance at all and is in fact effectively a rule instructing regulated entities how to custody assets. Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to submit the GAO's decision on SOB 121 into the record.
Without objection.
So in other words, the SEC issued guidance affecting banks without talking to the experts on bank custody. Think about that. The bank regulators and an independent body found that SOB 121 wasn't guidance at all, but a rule under the APA and CRA. Those are 2 big process fouls. If SAB 121 were truly non-binding guidance that the SEC claims, we would not be able to consider a CRA on the issue at all. The fact that we're even having this conversation today illustrates the scale of the SEC's mistake. I'm going to wind up here, but I want to just basically say that I think it is our responsibility to take this issue up in Congress. The SEC shouldn't arbitrarily prevent well-regulated banks from taking custody of investors' digital assets. Instead, it should find a different path forward with the prudential regulators. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The ranking member seeks recognition and is recognized.
I move
for
to
5
strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
The crypto industry has long complained about the lack of clarity from the SEC when it comes to crypto and how SEC supposedly only regulates crypto through enforcement rather than through regulation. The Staff Accounting Bulletin 121, which is a non-binding SEC staff guidance, aims to offer the very kind of clarity that crypto industry seeks for rules that apply to it. This bulletin offers specific accounting guidance on how crypto assets should be included on balance sheets. Notably, this guidance was offered to protect investors against the mishandling of customer crypto assets by custodians, a practice that was at the core of FTX's spectacular collapse when billions of crypto assets went missing. This staff bulletin is quite simply guidance. It is non-binding as it never went before the commission. It was offered by SEC staff to provide industry with the clarity that they asked for. And SEC staff does this quite frequently. I would call to everyone's attention to the number of this bulletin. It's number 121. There are 120 other bulletins, and unless this resolution becomes law, hopefully the SEC will continue to issue more. Nevertheless, some in the industry disagreed with SEC staff's guidance and have worked with Republicans to repeal it. But I'm not sure the industry realizes that by using the Congressional Review Act to overturn this proposal, it will only harm every market participant from Wall Street banks, private equity firms, and crypto companies. If this Congressional Review Act resolution is signed into law, it will have a chilling effect on the SEC's ability to issue staff-level accounting and legal guidance on any other issue in the future. That's because this resolution not only repeals the bulletin, but it prohibits the SEC from ever issuing a substantially similar bulletin again. Moreover, the SEC staff would likely think long and hard before ever offering guidance to public companies in the future, even on completely unrelated accounting topics. This resolution would cause serious harm to our markets, and I urge members to vote no. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Minnesota seeks recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
The SEC's Staff Accounting Bulletin 121, or SAB 121, is one data point of many at this point demonstrating both Chair Gensler's insistence on overstepping the SEC's authorities and his unrelenting prejudice toward the digital asset ecosystem. The SEC disguised this overreaching rule as guidance, circumventing Congress and public input. It did it so it could lock banks out of the ability to custody digital assets. The impact of this illegal rulemaking that's been in place nearly 2 years? Well, first, SAB 121 introduces more unnecessary and avoidable concentration risk into the digital asset ecosystem, making our markets not fair, not orderly, and not efficient. The Bitcoin ETFs are a great example. Not a single bank provides the custodial services for any of the 11 approved ETFs. This is risky. Second, SAB 121 weakens investor protection standards by forcing crypto users to rely on less regulated and less well-capitalized institutions for custody instead of using the established bank infrastructure. And third, SAB 121 hinders capital formation and global competitiveness because foreign banks are already able to compete in this market and American banks cannot. The SEC's statutory mission is to 1, protect investors, 2, facilitate capital formation, and 3, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets. Chair Gensler is violating all 3 with SAB 121, and we must pass this resolution so Chair Gensler's illegal rule ceases to be in effect. I applaud my colleague and friend from Nebraska, Congressman Flood, for his tremendous work to hold the SEC accountable, and I urge all of my colleagues to support this effort. I yield back the balance.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Nichols, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to join my colleague from the great state of Nebraska, Congressman Mike Flood to speak in support of our Congressional Review Act resolution to disapprove of the SEC's Staff Accounting Bulletin 121. Listen, folks, SAB 121 makes the digital assets industry less safe for consumers. It prevents well-regulated banks from safeguarding digital assets owned by their clients. SAB 121 requires banks to place custody digital assets on their balance sheet, contrary to how traditional assets are treated. Because banks must also follow prudential standards, placing an asset they don't actually own on their balance sheet means they have to pay prohibitively expensive capital and liquidity charges. It's no wonder we don't see any banks taking custody of digital assets at scale. Whether you support crypto or not, you should want the most heavily regulated financial institutions that are experts in custodial banking to safeguard assets. Otherwise, people will have to turn to riskier, unregulated options, putting both consumers and the financial system at risk. We're seeing this issue with SAB 121 play out in real time. The SEC's recent approval of spot Bitcoin ETPs, which I applaud, allows retail investors access to this asset class through a regulated product. However, 8 of the 11 spot Bitcoin ETPs are held at the same non-bank custodian. Notably, regulated banks aren't serving as custodians for any of these products as they would with a traditional ETP because of SAB 121. This could pose a concentration risk to the safety and soundness of the financial system. Additionally, the SAB's overly broad definition of digital asset doesn't differentiate between cryptocurrencies and tokenized deposit like bonds issued on a blockchain. This discourages responsible innovation with distributed ledger technology that could expedite and automate payment clearing, reconciliation, and settlement services. Last October, the Government Accountability Office concluded that the SEC breached statutory rulemaking requirements by issuing SAB 121, as it meets the Administrative Procedure Act's definition of a rule and must be submitted to Congress for approval. It's time for Congress to take action and conduct oversight of the SEC's misstep. Colleagues, I ask you to support our CRA of SAB 121 to protect investors and the financial system, encourage innovation, bolster American competitiveness, and restore the role of Congress in administrative rulemaking procedures. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now go to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Flood for his leadership on this issue, and I associate my remarks with the comments of Mr. Flood, Mr. Emmer, and Mr. Nickel. SAB 121 upends decades of precedent regarding the accounting treatment of custodial assets for banks. Federal Reserve Board Chair Powell, as already noted, stated in testimony that SAB 121 shifts us away from traditional custodial practices, emphasizing that custodial assets receive off-balance sheet accounting treatment. In theory, under SAB 121, a bank could custody digital assets. However, the conditions set forth by SAB 121 make it totally impractical for any bank. Currently, if a bank decides to custody digital assets and adhere to SAB 121, the on-balance sheet requirement would have significant knock-on effects on capital, liquidity, and other prudential requirements. Given the pendency of the onerous Basel III endgame proposal, this would further disincentivize financial institutions from taking on this additional liability. Effectively, this makes it difficult for the regulated institutions to provide custodial services for digital assets, even though they would have to receive permission from the regulator first. The fact is, the technological, legal, and regulatory risks cited in SAB 121 are addressed by the legal and regulatory framework that applies to banks' custodial activities. SAB 121 should have accounted for that. However, the SEC did not consult with any of the prudential regulators before issuing this guidance. Unfortunately, the failure to consult the regulators overseeing the varying institutions that are largely impacted by an SEC proposal has become quite common under Chair Gensler. The SEC does not have the expertise to assess the same risks as the prudential regulators and should not be in the business of proposing shoddy rulemakings and guidance that may have major implications to the functioning of our financial institutions and ultimately the safety and soundness of our financial system. Bottom line, it makes little sense to discourage well-regulated financial institutions from providing custodial services to crypto users, investors, and owners of digital assets. The ranking member commented on FTX, and we all want to avoid another FTX. But SAB 121 will produce more FTX scenarios because it will push innovation and custody of digital assets offshore, compromising American competitiveness. And yes, SAB 21 will actually undermine investor protection for this very reason. We have an opportunity to right the ship. We must ensure the proper regulators are being consulted on issues so that the cumulative effect of proposals and guidance are understood. Goodness sakes, let's not discourage well-regulated financial institutions from providing the protections that crypto investors deserve. I'd like once again to thank Mr. Flood and Mr. Nickel for their leadership on this issue and urge all my colleagues to support the resolution. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now go to the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes.
First, as a preliminary comment, I thank the chair for wanting to get to the other bills that were listed, including my Bank Safety Act, and I hope our next markup will also include my bill to deal with a problem at HUD that prevents homeless disabled veterans from living in HUD projects built on VA land. Now as to this.
Gentleman will yield. I'm familiar with the issue and look forward to working with you on it to address it.
This regulation may or may not be perfect. Even if it is imperfect, this CRA goes far beyond that. Because if this bill passes, not only is this regulation thrown away, but the SEC is prevented from adopting a similar or really any regulation in this space. One cannot argue that the financial statements should not show the investors in whatever custodian, whether it be a bank or other entity, that a lot of crypto is being held in custody, and that exposes the custodian to risks of hacking, risks of theft. That's a risk that needs to be disclosed. Now, you can argue that it shouldn't be on the balance sheet, that the SEC should change its regulation and put it in a footnote. But you cannot argue, given all of the fraud and all of the theft in the crypto space, that an entity could hold hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of crypto and not even tell its investors that it is running that risk. We are told that this rule or this that SAB number 121 will prevent banks from acting as custodians. Well, keep in mind there are really 3 different accounting systems, yielding 3 different results. This SAB 121 affects only the financial statements that go to the investor. The 2 other accounting systems are tax accounting that goes to the IRS and regulatory accounting, which is a 3rd and separate system. The bank regulators are free to instead regard this as a footnote disclosable item rather than an on-balance sheet item affecting the various ratios and capital requirements. So this rule will not do the harm that is being stated. But let's take a broader look here. Do we really want to pave the way for crypto to do what its proponents say it's going to do? Crypto is not currently a currency. Currently, it's an electronic pet rock. It is true that gold has a value, but that's from 10,000 years and more of human history. Crypto may be nothing more, and most crypto coins, I'm sure, are nothing more than non-fungible tokens. And to think that every collectible has value, if you believe that, you're welcome to bid on my meticulously curated stamp collection. What do the crypto people say they want? They want to be a currency, and why do we need a new currency? Because we want a currency secret from the federal government so that our sanction laws, our human trafficking laws, our laws against drug cartels, and most importantly, our tax laws cannot be enforced. And finally, what do the crypto advocates say they want to do? Partially displace the dollar in its role as a reserve currency. Why should that be important? Because if the dollar loses its role, then we are going to have to see massive tax increases, massive expenditure cuts at the federal government, or we're going to see massive inflation. Every American family benefits to the tune of many thousands of dollars a year in lower interest rates and other benefits from the fact that the dollar plays that role. So even if you think that crypto is as sweet as Pepsi, keep in mind every American family owns stock in Coke. And even if you think it's a wonderful thing, it is a competitor to the currency Americans own and invest in and have a democratic elective government that controls, and it displaces it with a rival product which may be as sweet in the view of some, but is designed to displace the one owned by the American people. So I don't think we should adopt this. It at best would pave the way for crypto to achieve its stated aims, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll go to the lady from California, Ms. Kim, for 5
Thank you,
minutes.
Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
She's recognized.
Thank you. I applaud the efforts of my colleague from Nebraska, Representative Flood, introducing this House Resolution 109. Thank you. The Congressional Review Act resolution will rescind the SEC's Staff Accounting Bulletin 121, or SOP 121, and allow banks to be on the level playing field when they compete for custody of digital assets. Rescinding SOP 121 will facilitate well-regulated entities to provide custodial solutions for digital assets and enable the digital assets market to grow at scale. By voting in favor of House Joint Resolution 109, we will incentivize competition of custody options for digital assets and mitigate against the risk of digital asset deposits being concentrated in a small set of companies. So I support this resolution, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. With that, I yield the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields the balance of her time. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we start to contemplate holding large amounts, potentially trillions of digital assets under the control of regulated banking institutions, there is a risk that I think is underappreciated, which is that the first state or non-state actor that obtains or produces a high-performance quantum computer will immediately be able to steal all Bitcoin and similarly encrypted assets. And so that is a risk that is very different between holding gold bars and holding crypto assets, where you can be doing everything perfectly, and then one day later, some foreign country with a high-powered computer owns everything. And so that kind of risk we have to think through before we allow large amounts of crypto assets on the balance sheets of the regulated banking institutions that we depend. And the danger of having a CRA on this thing would prevent any modifications of the regulations to in the foreseeable future to deal with this rapidly changing risk environment. And so I'm just not in favor of doing a CRA that would prevent any action in this space. That's it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now go to the Vice Chair, Mr. Hill, for 5 minutes.
Move to strike the last word. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Flood and Mr. Nickel for working on this, and I hear the concerns of some of my colleagues, but those concerns are not, in my judgment, best addressed at all in this manner. Because our prudential regulators, as Mr. Barr in his excellent remarks pointed out, have the full ability to have the right prudential supervision of how custody is done in our depository institutions and our non-depository trust companies regulated by the federal government and the state government. This rule, and the reason we're here today, is that this should not be addressed in this manner. And I want to just echo some of the comments that I've heard and outline that. Some would argue, and I think the ranking member certainly has, that the bulletin's not subject to CRA because it doesn't meet the Administrative Procedures Act's definition of a rule, that it's an agency statement, that it's not an agency statement of future effect. And
with all due respect to those who feel that way, that's not what the Governmental Accountability Office says. Senator Loomis asked the GAO to study this precise question. It's why we're here today. And SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce warned the commission they shouldn't go down this road because they were not on sound ground. So it's not committee Republicans that are claiming this bulletin is a rule, it's the GAO. So let's look at that. A statement issued by a subset of an agency may constitute an agency statement for CRA purposes, and that's what we see here. The SEC's Division of Corporation Finance is to monitor companies' compliance with accounting and disclosure requirements, and if they're non-compliant, they're referred to the SEC Division of Enforcement. So it's a rule. If it's enforceable, they can compel behavioral change. Therefore, the bulletin does have future effect. It does have the prescription and the future effect impact. So it, in my view, and I think more importantly, the GAO's view, that it does meet the definition of a rule. Second point I've heard today, that there's no legal precedent on custodying digital assets, so banks can't hold crypto in custody and claim they're not subject to significant risks. But the prudential regulators absolutely already approve that and have all the rules they need necessary to govern and mitigate any risk associated with that. The OCC says it's permissible for national banks to custody digital assets. The OCC Interpretive Letter 1179 confirmed that digital assets custody is permissible, but added that national banks need a non-objection before they do so. So they've got that double check. Fed policy imposes the OCC crypto requirements on Fed member banks. So I really think to what I've heard, this is not the place to do it. That's what the commission's done, and they've made an error. And secondly, this isn't the place to correct or put any remedial action in place if you're concerned about banks serving as custodians. And finally, and it happens over and over and over again in this administration, Mr. Gensler, the chairman of the SEC, is not coordinating with the other regulators. We see this time and time again. Jay Powell, FDIC, OCC, not consulted on this interpretive release. So I want to thank Mr. Flood and Mr. Nickel for calling attention to this. I believe it's clear that GAO says this is subject to, that it is a rule and therefore subject to the parameters of a CRA. I support this act and I yield back to the chair.
Would the gentleman yield to the chair?
Gentleman would yield to the chair.
I'd like to commend Mr. Flood and Mr. Nickel for their wise resolution here, and the CRA is appropriate at this time. My colleague from California, Mr. Sherman, outlines the discrepancies within accounting standards on these three standards. These three standards should ideally be unified. And when the Securities and Exchange Commission takes a willful path that other regulators are not taking, it will disadvantage customers, make the markets less safe, less sound, and in the event of a bankruptcy, riskier for those that are holding digital assets in a way that they think is like other products in custody at a financial services firm. So I think this is appropriate action for us to speak. My hope is we'll have a bipartisan outcome here with this vote, and I encourage my colleagues to vote yes and yield back. Is there further discussion, further debate? No further discussion, no further debate. The question now occurs on ordering HJ Res 109 reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A recorded vote is requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, please raise your hand. A sufficient number having raised their hand, a recorded vote is ordered pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules. The vote on this question is postponed. Lawler. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 6864, the HUD Accountability Act of 2023, introduced by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 6864, to amend the Department of Housing and Urban Development Act to require the Secretary of Housing.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentleman from New York has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6864.
Without
offered-
objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Law, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the most common refrains I hear when discussing housing with residents of the 17th District is their concerns about the affordability of housing. It remains a persistent challenge. And I took great interest to the ranking member's opening statement, in which she alluded to the recent hearing that was held in my district, discussing, among other things, affordability, the corruption at NYCHA, the New York City Public Housing Authority, and housing policy generally. I agree with the ranking member that housing policy is of major concern to our nation, which is why it was disappointing that not one of my Democratic colleagues decided to show up for the hearing. They could have offered their input on this important matter. They chose not to. With mortgage rates near their highest since the turn of the millennium, a limited housing supply in many communities, and ongoing supply chain and construction issues, it is perhaps the most difficult time to purchase a home in our region's history. The affordability crisis is further complicated by the fact that many homeowners remain unable or unwilling to sell their home for fear of losing their fixed low-rate mortgages obtained prior to 2022. This is causing the limited supply to increase in price while also seeing home sales fall over 16% in 2023 compared to 2022. The median cost to purchase a home is more than 5.6 times greater than the median household income nationwide. In Rockland and Westchester counties, according to the National Association of Realtors, the monthly cost of a mortgage was $1,000 more in 2023 than it was in 2022. And in Putnam and Dutchess counties, it was at least $800 more per month. In both instances, there are additional housing costs of almost $10,000 or more a year. For many families, it is totally unsustainable. Things are also difficult in the commercial real estate market. Commercial lending fell 52% in the second quarter of 2023. Higher interest rates and higher vacancies in certain areas are making it harder for borrowers to make debt service payments, and defaults and delinquencies, especially in the office sector, could hit the banking system especially hard, as half of all outstanding CRE mortgage debt sits on bank balance sheets. With roughly $1.2 trillion in outstanding commercial real estate debt that is potentially troubled, according to Newmark, and more than $626 billion of debt set to mature in the next 3 years, signs appear to be pointing down in the CRE space. With so much uncertainty in our housing markets, it is understandable people might look to HUD for its leadership on navigating these challenges. But what happens when HUD isn't around in the conversation to provide feedback on the options regular Americans ought to have? That's why we need greater oversight and participation from the department on these serious issues, which is why I asked my colleagues to support my bill, the HUD Accountability Act. The HUD Accountability Act will simply require the HUD Secretary to testify on an annual basis before the House Financial Services and the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committees. Specifically, it will ensure the Secretary addresses the current programs and operations of the Department, the physical condition of all public housing and other housing assisted by the Department, the financial health of the mortgage insurance funds of the FHA, oversight by the Department of grantees, efforts to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse, and any other relevant ongoing activities of the Department. As an agency with over 9,000 full-time employees and an annual enacted discretionary budget authority of more than $77 billion, periodic reports to Congress on the mission, activities, and accomplishments of HUD should be a recurring priority. An annual testimony requirement will allow for greater oversight of the agency to ensure taxpayer resources are effectively and efficiently used. The heads of several federal agencies that fall under the jurisdiction of the Financial Services Committee, including Treasury, the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, and the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, are required by various statutes to testify before the committee. However, there is not a similar requirement for HUD. Because there is not a formal oversight mechanism required for the agency, the committee relies heavily on the work of the HUD Inspector General and its mission. Recently, the HUD IG was part of an operation that led to the arrest of 70 New York City Housing Authority, or NYCHA, officials for bribery. NYCHA houses over 528,000 people in New York City. It is by far the largest public housing authority in the nation. The conditions of it are horrendous, and it requires oversight. And for these reasons, among many others, we need the HUD Secretary to come before us on an annual basis and testify. And I urge all of my colleagues to support this common sense measure. And I thank Chairman McHenry for having this markup and yield back.
The gentleman from California, Ms. Waters, seeks recognition.
Yes, thank you very much. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized on the A&S.
Mr. Chair, we have an affordable housing crisis, which is also contributing to a homelessness crisis. And we've received testimony in this room from countless witnesses about evidence-based ways to end these crises. We've also heard that allowing the homelessness crisis to continue will actually cost the federal government more money over time than addressing it today. And yet, the only housing bills that are being brought up at this markup are bills compelling testimony from the HUD Secretary and the Inspector General, which you, Mr. Chair, can already do. In fact, just last month, the HUD Secretary testified before this committee. But to be blunt, we don't need more testimony requirements. Although Republicans have held 6 hearings on housing this Congress, we had 55 hearings on housing when I was chairwoman. But maybe my colleagues weren't paying attention. The committee Republicans' oversight plan for this Congress didn't even mention homelessness. And unfortunately, the only bill that committee Republicans passed on housing so far this Congress actually made housing more expensive by raising fees on home buyers. Clearly, Republicans need help crafting legislation, and I would suggest they look no further than the extensive affordable housing agenda Democrats are advancing. Democrats have put forward several proposals, including my bill, H.R. 4233, the Housing Crisis Response Act, which would make the necessary investments in our nation's housing infrastructure to ensure affordability across America. Our legislation has garnered broad support from a broad spectrum of stakeholders, including homeowner and renter advocates, industry experts, like real estate brokers and home builders, homeless service providers, civil rights groups, consumer groups, and religious groups. So after a year of doing almost nothing on housing, Republicans are choosing to spend time debating a bill to require the Secretary of HUD to testify before Congress annually. No one is going to disagree with this because, Mr. Chair, requiring 1 hearing on housing each Congress is literally the very least that we can do. But even this bill demonstrates how Republicans just don't get the gravity of the housing crisis in America. The bill lays out what the focus of the Secretary's testimony should be, but nowhere does it direct the Secretary to comment on the affordable housing or homelessness crisis. It seems the sponsors don't want the Secretary to talk about the real struggles families are facing, and certainly don't want the Secretary offering solutions. Mr. Chair, the affordable housing crisis is real and requires Congress to act. Democrats have legislation that can be considered today. And so to my friend, Mr. Lawler, I understand the hearing that you held in your district. I understand that you're a real advocate for affordable housing, and you have real concerns about the homeless, just as many Democrats do. So why don't you just support my bill today? Why don't you just support a bill that would do something about housing? You can ask the Secretary of HUD to come over here 5 times in 1 year. It doesn't make any difference just to hear her talk about what it is and what it is not. But really makes a difference is when we get together and we decide that we're going to do something about homelessness. I'm going to vote for a bill that you have like mine. You vote for a bill like I have, and we'll get something done. With that, I yield to the gentleman, whether he wants to talk or not.
Surely. I know you had 55 hearings during your tenure as chair. I would note, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe 0 bills actually became law. We held a hearing last week, and no Democrats showed up, including New York Democrats that sit on this committee. The gentlelady sitting right next to you could have traveled 30 minutes to come up to the district and comment about homelessness in New
Reclaiming
York
my
City.
time. We don't want to come and talk anymore. We want to pass bills. We could go to hearings every day of the week, and we could talk about how bad it is, what we would like to see happen, but we want to pass bills. I'll yield back to the gentleman so he can respond.
You held 55 hearings and passed no bills.
12 bills passed into law last Congress on housing. 12. You forgot how to count?
12?
12.
Which bills?
12 bills.
American Rescue Plan.
American Rescue Act. Plan.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Further discussion, further debate. The Subcommittee Chair on Housing and Insurance, Mr. Davidson.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to recognize the great work of my friend from New York, Mr. Lawler, in introducing this bill and his other work on housing policy. Mr. Lawler has been a strong common sense advocate for affordable housing for American families, something that we discussed just last week in the field hearing in his district in New York. We saw firsthand how heavy-handed government mandates can squeeze homeowners and renters, putting affordability out of reach for many. We heard from local officials as well as several expert witnesses who testified about federal, state, and local policies that disadvantage the very folks the policies are supposed to be helping. And frankly, his district's one of the costliest areas in the country to live, but in all of our country, people are confronting challenges. He cited the nationwide average of median income to median household price or median house price to median income of 5.6. In his district, it's probably on the high end of that. In mine, it's a little lower. But houses are out of reach for everyday Americans. An overreaching message at the hearing was not only about the importance of local control, but also the often unrealized burden that housing mandates place on families. This drove home the need for robust congressional oversight over government agencies that implement our federal policies. Mr. Lawler's bill to require the HUD Secretary to testify at least once a year could not have come at a better time. And even the current HUD Secretary, Secretary Marcia Fudge, stated last month before the committee that H.R. 6864 is, quote, a reasonable idea and one that members ought to support. And with that, I encourage all of our colleagues to support this common sense approach and policy, and we should make it law.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for your leadership and for hosting the field hearing in my district and participating. I thought it was a very robust discussion. I wish my Democratic colleagues could have joined us so that we could engage on these issues. For instance, in New York City, where rent laws have created 50,000 vacant units. 50,000 vacant units in New York City because of the disastrous rent control laws in New York State. 50,000 units. Why? Because the cost of bringing those units up to code far outweighs what the landlords could recoup by rent. And so they choose to take a tax write-off instead of filling these units because it's too costly. Taxes continue to go up. Utility costs continue to go up. My colleagues don't seem to understand that if we want to create affordable housing, there needs to be a public-private partnership. And you look at the New York, you want to talk about homeless. The New York City homeless shelter system has seen a 53% surge in the number of people living in the system. Why? Because of the migrant crisis, the disastrous border policies of this administration. 53% increase in New York City. It was under 50,000 people living in the homeless shelter system. It is now upwards of 90,000 people. It is insane. We cannot continue with these disastrous policies. So I do believe housing is one of the most pressing issues. We are about 6 million units underbuilt in this country.
Would the gentleman yield?
Not yet. I want to finish and then I'll yield to you. We are about 6 million units underbuilt in this country. The cost of construction is astronomical right now. We need to bring down costs. If we want to deal with affordability, we need to look at this holistically. It is not just about affordable housing. People in my district cannot afford to live there. The average cost of a mortgage has gone up over $10,000 a year since Joe Biden took office. These policies are not working. And so I fundamentally believe that, yes, we do need to deal with this in a bipartisan way, and I stand willing to do that. But getting the HUD secretary to come on an annual basis and answer questions is critically important to that. She needs to be engaged in these topics. And with that, I yield to my colleague from New York.
So are you going to be willing to support the security bill that will have the border provisions when it comes from the Senate to the House?
Well, the Senate couldn't.
Because let me tell you.
Reclaiming my time. The Senate could not pass the bill. The Senate did not pass the bill. In the House, we passed H.R. 2 in May of last year, which you voted against, which actually would have secured the border.
Gentleman's time's
And so, yes, we do need to secure the border to deal with the migrant crisis in New York City. We also need to end the sanctuary city policy.
And gentleman from Ohio's time has expired. The gentlelady from New York seeks recognition and is recognized for 5 minutes.
So you want to deal with the vacancy of apartments in New York City? Support my bill, my Landlord Accountability Act, that will punish those landlords that keep vacant units. Do it. And talking about migrants on the border, it takes two to tango. And you have never been willing to sit down with Democrats in order to craft legislation. I'm talking about your side, your side. Mr. Chairman, I am appalled by the arrest of 70 NYCHA employees. These alleged crimes are an egregious breach of public trust, and those responsible must be held accountable. And by the way, Mr. Lawler, I didn't go to your hearing, but I promised you that I will come to your district. Instead of acting in the interest of NYCHA residents, the city of New York, or federal taxpayers, these defendants allegedly used their jobs at the authority line, their own pockets. Actions like these pose a significant risk to the integrity of public housing and HUD's other rental assistance programs. I appreciate the work of the HUD IG, who helped uncover this alleged conduct. There is no doubt that without them, this scheme would not have been uncovered, but it seems disingenuous to hold the HUD IG to stricter scrutiny than all the other IGs in this committee's jurisdiction. Currently, there is no other IG of a federal agency within this committee's jurisdiction that is subject to a statutory requirement to testify. While there is no doubt that there are problems at NYCHA, to turn NYCHA around, we need to make a commitment to it, not abandon it. NYCHA is the largest public housing authority in the country, providing housing to 1 in 17 New Yorkers in 300 developments around the city. Federal disinvestment in public housing has forced many residents to live an accelerating substandard living. NYCHA residents suffer from a consistent lack of hot water, insufficient heat during the winter months, rodent and insect infestation, broken elevators, and widespread and recurring lead and mold problems. Our country's affordable housing crisis didn't happen overnight and will not be solved immediately either. It took years of disinvestment for public and affordable housing to reach this crisis, and we must commit the necessary resources to fix this problem. Both Republican and Democratic administration are to blame. You cannot starve an agency or program of resources and then punish it when it doesn't work properly. I yield back. And I yield to the ranking member.
Thank you very much. I recall a call that I got from Ms. Velasquez a couple of years ago, a desperate call in the middle of winter in New York. There was no heating. And that absolutely drove me crazy in trying to do something about housing. So, Mr. Lawler, I tell you what I'd like to do. I'd like to give you my legislation. I'll take my name off of it. I give it to you. You can be the lead on it. If you will allow me, I will co-lead it. Let's get something done. You yield to him?
Yields back. So, does Ms. Velasquez yield back?
Yes, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
Yes, sir, I yield back.
The chair would like to remind members that it's now 11:15. We'll start voting on whatever bills we get through, or amendments we get through, or if we get through. We'll do that 1 hour before votes on the floor. That should be around 12:30. We'll start voting. I'm at the member's disposal here. If we wish to get through a bill, we'll vote on a bill. And if we wish to get through the full stack of 5, which is down from 12, we'll get through 5. And Ms. Waters has the 5th bill, to my Democrat colleagues. I'd say to my Republican colleagues, there are 4 Republican bills before that. Does any member seek further recognition on the ANS? Oh, well, you're still, did my subcommittee chair hear the chair's announcement?
The subcommittee chair did, and the subcommittee
May
chair
I also
significantly
further announce-
shortened his statement.
Well, may I further announce that my Democrat colleagues have an amendment if they wish to still offer that. Is the ranking member still interested in offering an amendment on the bill?
I have an amendment.
All right, so,
If I may, I'd like to welcome the children to hear about what we're trying to do about homelessness.
we'll try to clean up the language for our friends and colleagues. We'll recognize the ranking member for offering the amendment. Don't worry, you can still debate the ANS and the amendment at the same time. We can walk, chew gum, and hum at the same time. Gentlelady is recognized. The gentlelady has an amendment at the desk. Clerk will distribute and report, all that stuff.
Has it been distributed?
No,
Has the amendment been distributed?
it has not been distributed. We'll pause while the amendment is distributed. Yeah. Do all members have the amendment? Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to
Without objection, the
H.R.
amendment is considered as read. The gentlelady from California is recognized for her
Thank you very
amendment.
much, Mr. Chairman. As I've stated, I believe that housing must be a top priority for this committee, and I support a requirement for annual statutorily mandated hearings with the HUD Secretary. However, I'm concerned that the testimony required in this bill is not at all focused on addressing the nation's worsening affordable housing and homelessness crisis. But because I want to show bipartisan cooperation for my friend, I support this amendment. And that is why my amendment would require the Secretary's testimony to include HUD's progress in addressing the national affordable housing and homelessness crisis. It does not strike any of the other things that the bill's sponsor wanted the testimony to include. It simply adds this to the list in the bill. My amendment would also sunset the requirement after 5 years, giving Congress a natural juncture at which to reconsider this requirement. After a recent bill hearing that committee Republicans held last week in New York State, it is clear that our constituents are ready for Congress to work together to help address local housing and community development needs. Republican witnesses at that hearing, called on Republicans to fund more housing choice vouchers and provide incentives for private development of affordable housing, which is what my bill, the Housing Crisis Response Act, would do. I hope we can turn that talk into real action by taking up bills in this committee that actually address housing issues in this country. This amendment would ensure that these types of issues and solutions are discussed during any future hearing with the HUD Secretary. So bring on the HUD Secretary, accept these amendments, let's work together. And I ask for an aye vote from Mr. Lawler to lead the aye votes on this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Further discussion, further debate. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler, seeks recognition on the amendment.
Madam Ranking Member, I would be happy to accept this amendment. I do have one question, if you could answer. Why does it say during the 5-year period beginning on? So at the end of 5 years, we no longer need to talk about affordable housing? Why do we have a time period on this?
Well, it is not that we don't need to talk about it anymore. We will have solved the problem working together by that time, and so we won't need the 5 years. I yield back.
If you think affordable housing is going to be sold in 5 years, I have a bridge to sell you in Ms. Velasquez's district.
I'm very optimistic, Mr. Lawyer. Working together, we'll get this done.
I believe, I
Keep
certainly,
me out of it.
I certainly believe that it's important to talk about affordable housing, and I certainly will give you an aye vote on this amendment. I do want to just go back to two big things real quick. With respect to my colleague from New York, I co-led the Dignity Act last year, which is the first bipartisan immigration reform package in over a decade. I do not believe you are a co-sponsor on that bill. I certainly would welcome your involvement in that bill. I would also note of the 25 bills that did become law from Financial Services Committee, that were referred from the Financial Services Committee during the ranking member's tenure as chair, none of them have anything to do with housing. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Further discussion, further debate. Gentleman from Kelly. Gentleman from Kelly is recognized.
Thank you very much. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't going to speak, but every so often, actually not every so often, often, people say things that are just not true. And I don't know why they throw them out there, but they say things that are just not true. It was said earlier that not one housing bill was passed during the 117th Congress, not one housing bill. That's not true. In fact, those of us that were here know that's not true. I have a list here of bills that were passed and signed into law. I could read them off. I'm not going to waste our time. But it used to be that truth mattered, and people just wouldn't throw things out for a soundbite. And that's what's happening more and more, and I hope we don't do that. I hope that we stay factual. You can have different opinions, but let's not change the facts. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Further discussion, further debate. The gentleman from the Oversight Committee Chair, Mr. Heising, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I move to strike the last word to just
Gentleman
point
is
out.
recognized.
Thank you. I would just like to point out, and maybe knowing the answer to this, I believe, Mr. Chairman, we're debating H.R. 6864, not a whole bunch of other bills or the 5-year plan to solve homelessness or housing affordability, which will fly in the face of 60 years of precedent. But I wanted to give a specific reason why I support the efforts of Mr. Lawler. And I will point out that this was the fastest I've seen the federal government move. On January 11, we had Secretary Fudge in front of our committee. This was the first time, the second time she had been in front of us in 3 years, in the 3 years that she has held office. On January 11, I brought up Harbor Towers, a housing facility funded by HUD with massive, massive problems, much like what my colleague from New York was describing. This is in Benton Harbor. On January 24, I personally toured the facility with Mayor Marcus Muhammad to see for myself what was going on. At the hearing on January 11, the HUD secretary committed to working with my office. They got a response back quickly, and on February 13, a deputy secretary from HUD was on site at Harbor Towers with the folks talking about the issues of elevators not working and access to the building and illegal activities that have gone on, all those things. I firmly believe that if the secretary was not in front of this committee, we would not have seen that action. Why do I think that? Because it had been going on for years, begging for the attention of HUD at this facility. So what is the purpose of the bill? The purpose of the bill is to get somebody who is accountable, and by the way, this is part of our constitutional duty and requirement, oversight. And by the way, Mr. Chair, I'll point out that the Secretary of Treasury, the chairperson of the Financial Stability Oversight Council, Director of Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, the chairperson of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, the chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, and the vice chair of supervision are all required to testify in front of us annually, but not this HUD secretary. We have it in front of us today, folks. This is an effective oversight tool, regardless of who's in office at the executive level, regardless of who's in the majority in the House of Representatives. We need to have these administrators in front of our committee to do and utilize what is our constitutional duty, not just our right, it's our duty to perform oversight. So let's not get too caught up in how we're going to solve housing affordability in 5 years. Let's not get too caught up in some of the other ancillary discussions about who was more effective in leading the committee. We have a glaring hole in our oversight responsibilities that this is fixing. And I commend the congressman from New York, Mr. Lawler, on his efforts in doing so. And I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will realize that this is effective. Absolutely. The time is yours, sir.
Well, I thank my colleague for yielding. And if I may ask the ranking member, in the offering of this amendment to Mr. Lawler's underlying bill, if your amendment passes, would the ranking member support the underlying bill with her amendment included and ask her colleagues to vote for it?
Mr. Chairman, I wanted to save the gentleman a lot of time and passion about his support for the bill. I support it too. And of course, with this amendment, I will absolutely support the bill and urge my colleagues to do the same.
Great. Reclaiming my time, I'll yield to the chair.
I thank the ranking member, and I appreciate us bringing this back to what we're dealing with. So it sounds like we have support for this. I would encourage our colleagues to, if they have further discussion, further debate, to use that time to share those words directly with one another, rather than corporately. They can individually support that. And with that, I yield back to my colleague.
Reclaiming my time, I'm just glad I could get it back on track. Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I appreciate my colleague getting it back on track. In light of that, is there further discussion or further debate?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate the gentleman not taking the note, but the gentleman has every right to do what he wishes to do.
I yield to the ranking member.
Yes, go right ahead.
Well, I was asked to yield
Oh,
some time
excuse
to you.
me. We're anxious to have the record report correctly that housing bills that were passed in law during the 117th Congress, I believe the total number is 12. So we just want the record to show that. Thank you, and I yield back.
Without objection, that'll be included in the record. Further discussion, further debate? Hearing none. The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California, Mrs. Waters. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. For what, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, seeks recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Let's pause while the amendment's distributed.
Thank you.
What is this? Do members have a copy of the amendment that wish to have it? The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to
Without
H.R.
objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member. I first want to commend my friend and fellow Problem Solver Caucus member, Congressman Lawler, for his work on this crucial legislation. This bill is a win for accountability, oversight, and transparency, and I want to thank him. My amendment would simply add a topic to the HUD Secretary's required testimony. Specifically, my amendment would require the Secretary to present testimony regarding the effects of the changes made in 2017 to the state and local tax deduction, otherwise known as SALT, on the cost of homeownership for hardworking families in my state and across the country. The SALT deduction has been around since 1913, helping our families avoid double taxation for more than 100 years. Before the 2017 cap, you could deduct everything you paid, avoiding double taxation. The average SALT deduction taken in New Jersey was $19,000, nearly double the now current cap. The deduction put thousands of dollars back into the pockets of Jersey's middle-income families. The SALT deduction is the only deduction in the tax code that allows homeowners to deduct their property taxes and is essential for making life more affordable and homeownership more affordable. It also helped encourage and preserve homeownership for low and middle-income homeowners, especially our seniors who are often on a fixed budget. The cap has been disastrous for our families. Our taxes went up for millions of Jersey's hardworking families, and that's why I fought for years to bring the full SALT deduction back. We've helped pass it out of the House now 4 times since 2017, only to watch others in the Senate kill it. By restoring the SALT deduction, we will help nearly a third of New Jersey residents, almost 3 million people, get tax relief. 80% have incomes of $216,000 or less. In New Jersey, this is a middle-class issue. For many families around the country, this will be a tax cut if we restore SALT. It will stop double taxation and make life more affordable for teachers, nurses, police, firefighters, for the hardworking men and women of labor. Homeownership has been a cornerstone of the American dream, and HUD's mission is to create strong, sustainable, inclusive communities and quality, affordable homes for all. Assessing and testifying about the impacts that the SALT cap has had on the American residential housing market is well within that mission. I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment to promote common sense testimony about the impact of SALT on U.S. homeownership and families and on the American dream. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Further discussion, further debate. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank my colleague from New Jersey for offering this amendment. As we know, representing districts with high state and local taxes, this has a tremendous impact on home ownership. And getting the HUD Secretary's comments and insights on this is helpful as Congress seeks to enact policies moving forward. In 2025, Congress will be dealing with the expiration of the cap on SALT. And so this testimony certainly will be vital as we look to address the cap on SALT and the tax code moving forward. So I thank my colleague, Mr. Gottheimer, for offering this amendment, and I am in support of the amendment. I think that testimony will be incredibly valuable. The last thing I would note, the HUD Secretary went over 900 days without testifying before this committee. 900 days in which she did not come before us. So requiring the annual testimony is critically important, and I yield back.
Gentleman, you.
Yes, I yield to the chairman of the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee.
I would just like to observe that when the HUD secretary does appear before us, a note to all colleagues, you don't really need an amendment to the proposal to say all the things they address, because you will be recognized if you choose to attend the hearing, and you can ask whatever you would like to ask. And the HUD secretary will either give you an answer or evade such answers, as the secretary is apt to do, regardless of whomever the secretary is. So could we please stop the endless stream of amendments about subject matter that somebody might want to address at some hearing in the future and proceed to consider the bills? I yield.
I yield back to the chairman.
Quite succinct with the debate. Further discussion, further debate on the amendment? Hearing no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment, now offered by the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Godheimer. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Further discussion, further debate. There being no further discussion, further debate on the bill, the question now occurs on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended offered by the gentleman from New York. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is, we're done with the amendment. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Okay. All right. I'm catching up with my own script here. Sorry, folks. The question now occurs on ordering the bill, H.R. 6864, as amended, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Is there a recorded vote requested? Recorded vote is requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, please raise your hand. A sufficient number having raised your hands, recorded vote is ordered pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules. The vote on this question is postponed. I'll go to pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7280, the HUD Transparency Act, introduced by the gentlewoman from Texas, Mrs. De La Cruz. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 7280.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentlewoman from Texas has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7280, offered by Ms. De La Cruz.
You're going to object?
Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read. And is there objection to it being considered as base tax? No objection. There's no objection. The gentlewoman from...
You didn't tell me about it. You have an objection.
The ranking member registers an objection. The A&S will be considered as the First Amendment. The gentlewoman from Texas, Mrs. De La Cruz, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing up this important piece of bipartisan legislation. H.R. 7280, the HUD Transparency Act, is a good governance bill to require the Inspector General of HUD to testify before Congress annually. Given the magnitude of the federal dollars sent to HUD, the housing affordability discussion cannot be had effectively without HUD's commitment to be better stewards of our tax dollars and root out waste, fraud, and abuse where found. As HUD falls under the jurisdiction of Financial Services Committee, it should be the interest of the members of this committee to ensure that we have a formal oversight mechanism for HUD, which is something that is currently lacking. In fact, we rely heavily on the work of the HUD Inspector General to serve as a third-party voice and help share what they believe this committee should be focusing on. This legislation will act to support the mission of the HUD Inspector General, which is to, quote, safeguard HUD's programs from fraud, waste, and abuse, and identify opportunities for HUD programs to progress and succeed. The evidence supporting the need for this is simple. Until last year, the previous time that an official from the HUD Inspector General office testified before this committee was in September of 2018. With a budget of more than $70 billion, it is Congress's responsibility to ensure we are providing proper oversight to ensure those who most need assistance through HUD can get that assistance. The importance of many HUD's programs is not in question here. In fact, let me be very clear that many of the HUD's programs are critical to the communities that I serve, communities that are majority Hispanic and largely working class. This is not a partisan issue. Those that are legally entitled to support services through HUD should get those benefits. This legislation will aid the HUD Inspector General in ensuring an effective or an efficient HUD to carry out that important task. I look forward to working with members across this committee to accomplish this by moving forward the HUD Transparency Act today. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back for the discussion, for the debate. Gentleman from Missouri, seeks second.
Yes, to the.
No.
I have an amendment at the desk.
We can come back to general debate. Gentleman has an amendment at the desk. Are there copies at the desk? Has it been distributed? We'll pause while the amendment is distributed.
Okay.
We can come back to general debate,
All right,
too.
okay.
That's fine.
Jeez. They do it semi-annually.
Do all members have a copy of the bill, of the amendment? The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7280, offered by
Without
Mr.
objection, the
Cleaver.
amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 5 minutes to discuss his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would strike some of the existing language of the underlying bill and insert explicit language that the HUD IG shall present testimony on the IG's assessment of the extent to which HUD has resources to sufficiently carry out its statutory mission, as well as ongoing activities regarding any work of that office as appropriate. It is first important to acknowledge that the underlying bill would hold the HUD IG to a stricter standard than any other IG under the committee's jurisdiction without sufficient justification. There are currently no other IGs under this committee's jurisdiction subjected to a statutory testimony requirement, and this testimony is in addition to legislation we've discussed to require the Secretary to testify annually, and in addition to reports to Congress already submitted by the IG to this committee. I will also add that there is a semi-annual report by the IG and it's open and available to the public. So this is completely unnecessary, and this amendment that I'm submitting improves the legislation should the IG be subject to this unprecedented statutory requirements. Through its reporting process, HUD OIG is responsible for keeping HUD and Congress informed on issues and deficiencies and providing recommendations to improve the operations of HUD and its programs. Several HUD OIGS findings over the last few years are directly attributed to the damaging policy and practices under the prior administration and continued attacks on the agency's funding level. Many of the things we are asking the HUD secretary to do, we don't provide funds for her to do that. I don't know how and why we continue to demand things and we don't fund that we won't fund. Research has shown that HUD programs yield significant benefits for recipients, including the reduction of poverty. Indeed, studies have shown that major investments included in the American Rescue Plan, ARPA, alone, which includes nearly $50 billion in housing investments, have lifted more people, including more children, above the poverty line in a single year than any other piece of legislation enacted in more than 50 years. However, funding for housing programs continues to be far short of the need, and the agency lacks important funding to complete. It is important that the Inspector General, in promoting its mission of integrity, efficiency, and effectiveness of HUD programs and operations, first and most importantly, answer the question of whether the agency has been provided the necessary resources to do the work that Congress has required. And if not, describe how this lack of resources is impacting the department's work, including the integrity, effectiveness, and efficiency of HUD programs. I yield back.
Is there further discussion, further debate? The gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
I strike the last word. Mr. Cleaver, thank you so much for putting this amendment forward. Unfortunately, I do not support this amendment. First, the HUD IG actually welcomes the opportunity to come before Congress. And what we're simply asking in this legislation is that we ask them about their current mission as the HUD Inspector General, which is to safeguard HUD's programs from fraud, from waste, and abuse. I'm sorry, but I cannot support this legislation. I yield back.
Further discussion, further debate?
She says she
The ranking member seeks recognition and is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I move to support the last word. This amendment would ensure that any HUD IG testimony includes a discussion about the state of funding and staffing resources at HUD that are critical to meeting its mission. Currently, the underlying bill does nothing to address whether HUD and its programs are adequately resourced to address growing housing needs across the country. I would like to point out that last year, when the chairman called the IG up for testimony, as is already within his authority as chair, many of the issues raised by the HUD IG were a symptom of a chronic disinvestment in HUD and its programs. For example, my Republican colleagues highlighted a HUD IG report that found there was an unutilization of HUD rental assistance vouchers, which Republicans blamed on the Biden-Harris administration. But the underutilization actually occurred under the Trump administration. And in fact, the underutilization of vouchers was a result of a lack of funding to meet the cost of rising rent prices. I urge my Republican colleagues to redirect their focus toward empowering HUD with the resources it desperately needs rather than slashing the federal housing budget. I urge my members to support Mr. Cleaver's amendment. I yield the remaining time to Mr. Cleaver.
Strike that word. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Ranking Member. I appreciate the comments, and as I've said many times over the years, I lived in public housing. My whole family did for 7 years, and I go by there now, and they look exactly like they did when our family moved out. Right now, we need $65 billion with a B just to do the necessary repairs, just to bring things up to some kind of a minimum standard. And so if we're going to require the IG to come in with reports about, progress and so forth, I think we've got to think seriously about providing dollars so that the IG would have a chance to actually measure things. We don't even need an IG to tell us how bad public housing units are around the country. They're in decrepit condition, and they will not get out of that condition until we decide that housing is significant and we've got to provide the dollars to do it. It is a tragedy that this is happening in the United States of America. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I yield to Mr. Sherman.
Well, it's the ranking member's time. Oh, it's ranking member's time. Yep. And does the ranking member?
I simply would ask for support for this amendment.
And
I think
do you
the
wanna yield to
gentleman
Mr.
makes a
Sherman?
good call.
Do you want to yield to Mr. Sherman?
I'll yield to Mr. Sherman.
I just want to put something in the record in the appropriate place for the prior bill that we dealt with. It is an article titled "How Do Crypto Flows Finance Slavery? The Economics of Pig Butchering." So I'd like unanimous consent to put that in the record.
That's acceptable under general leave. Does a ranking member yield back?
I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. The amendment does two things, right? And the way I read this, Mr. Cleaver, is that it strikes line 12 of page 1 and all that follows through page 2 of line 2. So what you're taking out of the bill, let me just read for members' attention. It takes out that the Inspector General should testify about efforts to detect and prevent fraud, waste, and abuse, the ability to conduct and supervise audits, investigations, and reviews, actions to identify opportunities for the programs, the Department of HUD to progress and succeed, and recommendations to improve overall efficiency and public accountability. Those are the words in Ms. Dela Cruz's bill that get struck as a result of this amendment. If the gentleman had an addition, resources sufficient to carry out a statutory mission as an addition, rather than taking out those very important 4 items in this bill, I would welcome it. I think the bill sponsor would welcome additionalities. But to gut the bill and to ensure the IG testifies about efforts to detect and prevent fraud, I don't think that's conforming with good public policy. So this, I think, is a gotcha amendment in the construct of it because it guts all the important reporting requirements we want every IG of government to testify about and to have reports about. So, I don't support the amendment because I think it is inappropriate for what we want from every IG. And so I urge my colleagues to vote no on the amendment and to support the other. Well, that's actually a very good point. Would the gentleman, would the sponsor of the amendment be willing to withdraw and address it in the way that I'm saying, add it as an additionality to the list in the effort for us to get to a bipartisan solution? If it's an addition to the things we want the IG to testify about, I would welcome it, and I would urge my colleague from Texas to accept that, because it's clear we've got failures, and we have failures of what we say to the agencies to do and the ability for those agencies to do it. And that's important information, and I would welcome that, and I think Congress should welcome that.
We'll strike the last word.
Yes.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant, Mr. Chairman. That's brilliant. I will.
Okay. So, gentlemen, will withdraw, and then we will work on the drafting. We'll come back to this. Is that?
Yes.
Okay. Gentlemen, withdraws the amendment. We will now go back to the underlying bill for further discussion, further debate. while we address this, I would say to my colleague, before we vote on this bill, we will ensure that you have the opportunity to offer another amendment. I thank you, Mr. Cleaver. With that, further discussion, further debate?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
I'd move to strike the last word.
Gentleman moves to strike the last word on the underlying
Correct.
A&S. Mr. Huizinga from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to move through this quickly and
I move
express
to
my
strike the last
support for my friend Ms. De La Cruz and her work on this. Mr. Chairman, when you named me chairman of the committee's Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, I've had the opportunity to work with a number of IGs, and my respect and appreciation for their work has grown, and they really, truly are contributors to our oversight. In fact, the first hearing I had as chair of this subcommittee was to bring various IGs from agencies under our jurisdiction, and they are an essential check on every agency's leadership. And look, we know, Mr. Chair, that regulators in Washington these days continue to test the bounds of their authority, both the traditional roles that they have had, and I would argue the legal roles that they have had, oftentimes through rulemaking and letters through enforcement and regulation through enforcement. Congresswoman De La Cruz legislation offers a thoughtful solution to that. It's not new working with IGs. In 2022, the SEC's IG issued a report on management and performance challenges, informing members on systemic problems at the agency. That report helped us understand the complex challenges facing the SEC and its chairman as they embarked on their current rulemaking agenda. In the 115th Congress, my good friend and former chair of this subcommittee, Mrs. Wagner, held numerous hearings with the HUD IG that exposed deficiencies, including waste, fraud, abuse, and within the agency's CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. And she used those hearings to work on legislation that made structural changes to the program and did so in a bipartisan manner. Today's bill, of which I'm a proud co-sponsor, makes sure that this committee, this body, hears from the HUD IG regardless of who is chair and in the form of an annual testimony. I know it's been questioned as to whether this is necessary. I think we have seen a growing pattern, Mr. Chairman, of department heads, division heads, whether they be undersecretaries or full secretaries. We have seen agencies become more and more and more reluctant and frankly sometimes refusing to come before these bodies. Mr. Lukemeyer talks about this often every time Secretary Yellen is in front of us about her unwillingness to come in before his small business committee, for example. And we have got to look for tools that are going to allow us and frankly force us as a constitutional standing in this process to make sure that we are doing the oversight that is necessary. And fortunately, in the past, this committee has had good working relationships with the HUD IG's office. I'd like to formalize that. I'd like to make sure that we have those inspector generals. Today it's for HUD. I'm willing to explore other other IGs being compelled to come and testify because I think they are very, very valuable sources of information for us. And look, this is an agency that has had critics and skeptics on both sides of the aisle through, frankly, its entire existence. And this is going to allow us as a body the opportunity, no matter who is in the White House, no matter who has the gavel of this particular committee or the gavel of the House or the Senate, is going to allow us to do that proper oversight and compel the IG to be here. So with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The ranking member seeks recognition, and I would have an announcement for members that our intention is to start votes in committee at around 12:30. That gives us the opportunity to get through what are likely to be 4, 5, 6, 7 votes before we get to the House floor and make sure that everybody knows. My hope is that we can get through our products today, the 5 bills, and get through that with time for us to start votes at 12:30. Ranking members recognized for the debate on the ANS.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Once again, in the absence of any real legislative solutions to the dire housing issues that our constituents are facing, committee Republicans are desperately engaging in performative actions like debating and passing this bill. H.R. 7280 would require HUD's Inspector General to testify before Congress on an annual basis. While this may seem harmless, if unimaginative, I want to be clear, there is no other Inspector General under our jurisdiction who is subject to a statutory testimony requirement. This bill singles out HUD for additional scrutiny and oversight in a way that I don't think is appropriate. What's more, while Democrats have multiple legislative solutions that would directly respond to the affordable housing and homelessness crisis, Republicans have proven that they're all talk when it comes to housing. It's imperative to question not only the rationale behind a bill that subjects the HUD Inspector General to an unprecedented standard, but also what this committee gains from yet another statutorily required hearing. Committee Republicans have already failed to hold several mandated hearings that are statutorily required by this Congress. For example, Chair McHenry has ignored the Temporary CARES Act mandate for the Federal Reserve Chair and the Treasury Secretary to testify semi-annually, the Dodd-Frank Act's mandate for the chair of the Financial Stability Oversight Council to appear annually, and the requirement for the Treasury's Office of Financial Research to provide annual testimony. So I'm disappointed, to say the least, that the best ideas on housing that Republicans have to offer today are to require hearings on the topic. You control the agenda. If you want the Inspector General to testify, simply invite him. Mr. Donaldson told you how to do it. He said, look, you can call him before this committee and ask him anything that you want. And so I agree with him. When Democrats were in charge in the 116th, 117th Congresses, we demonstrated that housing can be a bipartisan issue. In fact, in the 117th Congress alone, we passed 12 housing bills into law with broad bipartisan support. So it is not a question of whether or not there is room for bipartisanship on housing, because Democrats already proven through our actions that there is plenty of room to work together on housing. There should be nothing more bipartisan than housing, because it affects every single person profoundly. But this is the first markup under committee Republicans that has included a single bill focused on HUD, and these bills do nothing to actually address housing problems in America. This bill is only an attempt to try to blame HUD for the failings of House Republicans to prioritize affordable housing. So for all of these reasons, I call on my colleagues to oppose this bill and would advise them to take Mr. Donaldson's advice and just call whomever you want before the committee and ask them whatever you want. I yield back the balance of my time.
Would the gentlelady yield to me? Would the gentlelady yield?
Yes, gentlelady yields.
And I think members need to understand this, that the ranking member and the chair of this committee try to work together to get administration officials to testify when they're statutorily required. And when Ms. Waters was in the chair and I was ranking member, we were frustrated. We were frustrated by 2 administrations on getting them to testify as they were statutorily required.
Which ones?
Both Trump and Biden. And now I'm dealing as a Republican chair with a Democrat administration, and I share the frustrations that the ranking member had just a short time ago with a Republican administration. We, on a bipartisan basis, need to hold both sides accountable, even when it's inconvenient, even when we have people testifying that because we're in the same party, may be uncomfortable with their ability to testify. And maybe I experienced that. Right? Over time. I think we all have. But we've got to go reassert our authorities as Congress, and I think we should work together to that end. and as best we can.
Thank you. I reclaim my time, and the gentle lady reserves the right to change her mind.
Jill lady yells back. All right. Talk about dropping the mic. All right. So for what purpose does Ms. Garcia from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have a amendment at the desk.
We'll pause while the amendment's distributed. The clerk will distribute the amendments.
Copy my amendment. Hasn't changed.
Do all members have a copy of the amendment? The clerk will report.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7280, offered by Ms. Garcia of Texas.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman is recognized on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment seeks to strengthen Representative de la Cruz's bill, which would require the HUD Inspector General to testify on an annual basis, and also ensure that we make the best of the committee time with the IG to address pressing housing and affordability issues that are facing families across the country. Specifically, my amendment would require HUD IG to address in their testimony the impact of providing a $25,000 annual housing assistance subsidy to low and moderate income families who are struggling to keep up with skyrocketing rents that are resulting in evictions, damaged financial histories, job losses, and homelessness. As you're well aware, Mr. Chairman, Congress provides members with a per diem rate to help pay for our lodging in D.C. Depending on session days, the total reimbursement could equal to about $25,000 or more annually. So this amendment really is about, if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. I know that many of us rely on this allowance to live and effectively conduct our work here in Congress. I know I do, because I'm not sure about you, Mr. Chairman, but I'd rather not sleep in my office. The reality is that 1 in 4 households in the United States who qualify for rental assistance actually receive it due to federal disinvestment in housing. In fact, federal investments in housing represent less than 1% of total federal spending since fiscal year 2019, as skyrocketing housing costs have outpaced minimum wage gains. According to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, there is no state, county, or metro area in the nation where a minimum wage worker can afford the modest rent on a 2-bedroom apartment. Nowhere, no matter if it's a Democratic or Republican district, no matter if it's urban or rural or suburban, no one can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. It's no wonder we saw a 25% jump in the number of people who were experiencing homelessness for the first time in their lives between 2022 and 2023. This is what today's housing crisis looks like, and it will get worse if we don't do something. So just as we get, or can get, an allowance for reimbursement that could be equal to $25,000, or frankly, much more, depending on session days, depending on the rent, depending on per diem rates, housing rates, for hotel rates. So it could be at least $25,000. I think it is only fair that the federal government consider the same benefit for the lowest income people in this country who are struggling every day to choose between keeping a roof over their head, feeding their families, fixing their car, or attending to their health care needs. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this amendment, and as I said early, what's good for the goose is always good for the gander. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Ohio, Subcommittee Chair on Housing, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I strongly oppose this amendment. Frankly, it's a down payment on universal basic income. It's a theatric kind of statement. It's a non-serious amendment. It should be treated as such. I urge all of our colleagues to oppose it. But I'd also like to thank Ms. Dela Cruz, who's done excellent work in bringing to light the need for a thorough examination of the waste, fraud, and abuse at HUD, something HUD Secretary Fudge seemed to know little about when she came recently. It does seem like the hits keep coming, unfortunately, for HUD, including recent arrests of 70 New York Public Housing Authority employees in what the Department of Justice referred to as the largest number of federal bribery charges in a single day in history. That's shocking. And if that doesn't call for this particular IG to come talk to us, I can't say that we're taking seriously the need for oversight of HUD. It is broken, and frankly, everyone in the safety net that we have funded as a federal government should be given dignity. They should live somewhere where there aren't 50,000 units made not available because it's not cared for, and there aren't people engaged in actual corruption. So while the Secretary might not need to know about everything there, the Inspector General is supposed to be able to detect it and to provide accountability for the American people. There's no better tool for holding federal government agencies accountable than Congress, and there's no better watchdog for Congress than Inspectors General. The HUD Inspector General's office played a key role in bringing these NYCHA employees to justice, but their important work won't stop there. The HUD Office of the Inspector General is responsible for all audits, evaluations, investigations, and other reviews of programs and operations of HUD. In fact, last year, the HUD Office of Inspector General audits found over $7 billion in HUD funds that could be put to better use and recovered over $18 million in collections, over $40 million in restitutions and judgments against bad actors. It's time for us to provide that sort of oversight and accountability. And as you yourself pointed out, Chairman, it's been hard to compel the attendance and participation of some of the administration officials. In fact, I think it's worthy of consideration of Congress that inspectors general actually are part of the ledge branch instead of the executive branch, because the practice of providing accountability for the executive agency seems often to be co-opted. And so I think this doesn't go that far, but it does at least provide a hook to bring that Inspector General here annually. And I think it's a great piece of legislation. Thank you, Ms. Dela Cruz, for offering it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Further discussion, further debate. The ranking member seeks recognition on the amendment.
Move to strike the last.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank Ms. Garcia for her amendment, which would require the HUD IG to testify on the impact that guaranteeing every low and moderate income household a housing subsidy, like what is currently provided to members of Congress, would have in housing stability and reducing homelessness. Following reports that members of Congress were using their congressional offices as public housing, we saw our annual compensation increase to help members navigate increased costs of living, including the rising cost of housing. But when it comes to people who work 2 jobs and still can't afford their rent, or people who have been saving for years but still can't afford a down payment on a home because of rising housing costs, my Republican colleagues are proposing to slash the federal housing budget, which would only make it harder for countless people in these kinds of situations and push millions into homelessness. Why the double standard? I ask my colleagues a simple question. What would the world look like if we had the courage to treat our neighbors as we treat ourselves? So I urge my colleagues to support this common sense amendment, and I yield back.
Further discussion, further debate? No further discussion, further debate on the amendment. The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Garcia. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The nays have it. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The changes that have been made are acceptable.
All right. Well, is there a copy of the amendment at the desk? One the clerk will distribute, and we'll pause while we're distributing that.
Yes.
Clerk will report.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a
Without objection, the
substitute.
amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment, I think, does exactly what the gentlewoman wanted to do, and you know, with no additional changes, I would ask for a positive vote on this amendment.
As the gentleman will yield, I would urge members to support this nice addition to the amendment. Does the gentleman yield back? Or does the gentlelady from Texas ask the sponsor of the amendment to yield?
Will you please yield to me, Mr.
Yes,
Cleaver?
I yield to the gentlewoman from Texas.
Thank you. Mr. Cleaver, while I do understand the desire to want to know if the resources are sufficient, may I ask you, what is your understanding of this word assessment?
Well, my understanding is, and I'll read it, no later than October 1 of each year, the Inspector General of the Department of Housing and Urban Development shall appear before the committee, blah, 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 all the way down, and it ends with saying, Urban Affairs of the Senate, and present testimony on the Office of Inspector General's efforts to detect ability, actions, and assessments, assessments of the extent to which the Department of
If the gentleman will yield to me again. What I'm concerned about is that when I read the word assessment, are you asking them to come with some type of report? Or is it just their opinion on what is happening within HUD when it comes to resources?
Well, it's generally their opinion anyway, and it would be the IG assessing, like all the inspector generals. Just, I mean, I'm short on words because assessment is assessment.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
So I guess what my question is that if we have the Inspector General in front of us, you have the opportunity to ask her assessment of the resources available. All of us are afforded that opportunity. And so I question the amendment and why it needs to be within the legislation when it is we're asking her opinion anyway.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
And if I would say to my colleague from Texas, I thought we'd had this discussion in private, but the words in this are conforming with the rest of the IG's normal legislative language, legal language. They give their analysis, they give their assessment. This is a standard function of what we used to call the government auditing office that we now call the Government Accountability Office. So it's much more of an auditor term, not some questionable language in my assessment of it. Well, I just used the word. In my view of it, and so I would ask my colleague to look at to be willing to accept the language in the goal of getting a bipartisan outcome for the overall bill, and in some effort for us to get our legislative work done.
Mr. Chairman, gentlewoman from Texas, this adds nothing to it. This is not taking anything away or adding anything to it. This simply does what the IG does.
Does the gentleman have further questions? Okay, does the gentleman yield back?
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion, further debate? The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Is there a gentleman from Missouri seek recognition?
Recorded vote.
Gentleman asked for a recorded vote. A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is ordered pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules. Further proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Is there further discussion, further debate? There being no further amendments, without objection, the previous question is ordered, and recorded votes on the amendments have been postponed. Once those votes are taken, the committee will immediately consider the question to report the measure. We'll now move on to Mr. Fitzgerald's legislation, copies of which were distributed in advance. H.R. 7156. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 7156, the Combating Money Laundering and Cybercrime Act of 2024, introduced by the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 7156.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open amendment at any point. The gentleman from Wisconsin has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7156. Offered by Mr. Fitzgerald.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read and will serve as base text pursuant to the purposes of amendment. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'll move to strike last
The
word.
gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The U.S. Secret Service investigates a variety of cyber-related criminal activities, including the illicit use of digital assets through its global network of 42 cyber fraud task forces. Significant aspects of this illicit activity involve unlicensed money transmitting businesses, the illicit structuring of transactions, and other criminal activity against organizations that are not federally insured financial institutions, but are financial institutions as defined under the Bank Secrecy Act. That's why I was proud to introduce the Combating Money Laundering and Cybercrime Act, along with my colleagues, Mr. Meeks, Mr. Nunn, and Ms. Dean, to harmonize criminal and banking statutes and clarify the Secret Service's investigative authority over crimes related to illicit digital asset transactions. This legislation also expands the sunset by 5 years on the reporting requirement of FinCEN relating to benefits realized by law enforcement agencies from partnering with financial institutions, among other purposes. Finally, it extends the sunset, as I said before, by 5 years of a provision of the International Financial Institutions Act, which instructs the director of IMF to use the voice and vote of the United States to support the increased use of administrative budget of the fund for technical assistance that strengthens the capacity of members of the fund to prevent money laundering and the financing of terrorism. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this bipartisan bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Move to strike the last word, and I'd like to thank Representative Fitzgerald for his leadership on this important legislation that addresses gaps in our ability to investigate illicit crimes using digital assets. I want to thank the gentleman and look for and to continue to work with him as we move forward. As it is clear now, more than ever, the evolving technological landscape presents boundless opportunities for good as well for harm. While much of our work serves to support and uplift the American people as the financial service industry evolves, we must always also remember bad actors and enemies of the state are ready to seize upon opportunities for nefarious purposes. As financial criminals increasingly and persistently look to utilize digital assets in this work, this legislation allows us to better equip those investigating and preventing it. The 2024 National Money Laundering Risk Assessment demonstrated that updates to this legislation allows us to better address threats from nations like and including Russia and North Korea. By expanding the scope of U.S. Secret Service investigations and bringing digital assets in line with other fungible property used to commit crimes, what this bill does, it brings another element of protection and defense in line with the 21st century. And so, I again thank Representative Fitzgerald for this provocative work in this space and the opportunity to be a part of it. And I urge my colleagues, I think that we should all join with a unanimous vote in favor of this critical update to our country's crime-fighting abilities. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, seeks recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I want to recognize the incredible work put forth by this committee and thank my colleague, Representative Fitzgerald, as well as the bipartisan work of Representative Meeks in working on two critical bills in this markup, both of which I'm proud to be a co-sponsor on. Personally, as the former director of cybersecurity at the White House and serving as the nation's first counterintelligence officer in cyber, I have witnessed firsthand the importance of prioritizing cybersecurity. Cyber crimes in the United States have resulted in the loss of hundreds of billions of dollars and is a direct threat to my folks, not just in Iowa, but around the globe. In fact, the cost of cyber crime, money laundering, is expected to reach nearly $11 trillion. Now, to put that into context, that is the budget for Germany, the budget for Japan, the budget for Brazil, all combined are the equivalent of the amount of cyber money laundering that's happening in the criminal underworld today. This bill, the Combating Money Laundering and Cybercrime Act, significantly strengthens the U.S. Secret Service's ability to investigate the full spectrum of cybercrimes without compromising the innovation in this space. This is a bipartisan bill, and it closes the gap to empower our Secret Service professionals to continue to investigate cyber criminals, including cases involving digital assets, not just here at home, but around the globe. We must give our security professionals every tool in the kit to combat the evolving cybercrime space, and this bill, bipartisanly, has the ability to tackle that. So thank you to the co-sponsors, thank you to the lead, and compliments to the Financial Services Committee for truly being a champion on this. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The lady from California seeks recognition.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Cybercrime, and particularly cyber-enabled financial crime, is a growing and persistent threat to American citizens and industry. We see this in the commission of frauds on seniors and hacks on our small businesses, whether they're so-called pig butchering schemes or ransomware attacks, taking Americans' personal and proprietary data, life savings, and access to vital resources and services. The United States Secret Service is one of the law enforcement agencies that investigates these financial crimes, and this bill clarifies that agency's authority extends to digital asset transactions and transnational cybercrime. I support this, and I also support the inclusion of extensions to two critical mandates in the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, including the sunset on the FinCEN Exchange Report, which is a valuable public-private partnership program at Treasury. I thank Mr. Meeks and Mr. Fitzgerald for his work on this bill, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion for the debate? There being no further discussion for the debate or amendment to the bill, the question now occurs on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman from Wisconsin. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on ordering the bill, H.R. 7156, as amended, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Is there a request for a recorded vote? Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, request a recorded vote? Yes. Thank you. Thank you. That was subtle. That worked out well for everybody. Recorded vote is requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, please raise your hand. A sufficient number having raised their hand, a recorded vote is ordered pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules. The vote on this question is postponed. We'll now go to the ranking members bill. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 7462, the Wildlife Insurance Coverage Act of 2023, introduced by the gentlewoman from California, Ranking Member Waters. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 7462. To
Without
require
objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. The gentlewoman from California has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which were distributed in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7462.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. The ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes, but before I recognize the ranking member, at the immediate end of discussion debate on this, we will go through and start voting. Once we have members fully here, we'll start voting on the CRA, which is the first amendment, first bill offered by Mr. Of the day, offered by Mr. Nunn, and we'll proceed from there. I'll make an announcement there. But what stands between us and votes to the floor is the nature of the debate on the ranking members. Very good and very important bill. I'll now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My bill, H.R. 7462, the Wildfire Insurance Coverage Study Act, would require the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, to conduct studies assessing the danger that wildfires increasingly pose to communities and how the market for homeowners insurance is responding to this growing threat. Communities across the country, from my state of California and Hawaii to Colorado and Texas, are increasingly affected by devastating wildfires. In fact, just yesterday, 850 acres of the Texas Panhandle were engulfed in a blaze of wildfires that cut communities off from the power grid and were made worse by a lack of water. To put the fires out, Governor Abbott issued a disaster declaration in 60 counties affected by the fires. As the risk and effects of climate change continue to worsen, we have seen segments of the insurance industry began to halt new business. And in states like California, Florida, Texas, and Louisiana, where insurers have already began to halt coverage entirely for certain perils, growing wildfire risk will only make it worse. This means less coverage options and higher insurance payments for everyone across the country. While the business of insurance is primarily regulated by the states, insurance has nationwide implications on consumers, financial markets, and systemic risk. For example, when insurers halt wildfire and other forms of coverage in certain communities, it can make it difficult and more costly, or even impossible for homeowners to purchase homes in those areas, and it makes it harder for communities to recover from major disaster events. The increased risk of disaster events like wildfires no doubt poses a significant hurdle for insurers across the country. This is not the first time in our nation's history that consumers have faced a lack of insurance options. In response to private market failure that resulted in a lack of availability of flood insurance coverage in the United States, Congress created the National Flood Insurance Program in 1968 with the passage of the National Flood Insurance Act today. The NFIP offers affordable flood insurance coverage to anyone who needs it, including homeowners, renters, and businesses. In the case of wildfire insurance coverage, we're at a critical juncture where we need to better understand insurer challenges as well as how to prepare and protect families, their homes, and our economy against this growing risk. My bill, which passed the House with bipartisan support last Congress as part of the Wildfire Response and Drought Resiliency Act, will help us determine what the best federal response is to these issues. So I thank the chair for working with me on this bill, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote yes.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Yes.
I thank her for offering this very good and very important bill. California is not the only state experiencing this, but experiencing it like no other. And for the ranking member to address an important issue for our most populous state is important. But it's overall important for us to understand that wildfires have burned through over 10 million acres and caused $16 billion of damage just in the year 2020 alone. Climate change and the changing nature of our weather patterns is evident to those that underwrite insurance. That is not about the political debate on climate change. It is about what the insurers are seeing in real losses, homeowners experience in rising homeowner insurance rates. Those things are clear to those that rate risk. We can debate the political stuff of climate change, sure, but the data indicates that we have more expensive weather patterns that are causing real people real dollars. And our flood insurance program that the ranking member and I have worked together well on, that is one area that's experiencing losses that are very different than what they were 40 or 50 years ago, or 30 or 40 years ago. So I appreciate the ranking member addressing this and figuring out how we lower the risk of wildfires, reduce the damage they cause, and better financially protect homeowners through insurance should help us to improve outcomes for the millions of Americans who are impacted. And I appreciate the ranking member working so diligently on this issue. And with that, I would urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back to the ranking member and thank her for yielding.
Thank you.
Further discussion, further debate?
Green from Texas.
Mr. Green, and I would just remind my colleagues that are coming in that at the conclusion of this debate, we'll start voting. And since votes are called at 1:30 on the floor, we're pushing up on time. I yield, gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I promise to be brief. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate greatly your commentary, and I want to thank Ranking Member Waters for what she's done to bring this issue to fruition. In my state of Texas, we currently have about 60 counties that are being impacted by devastating wildfires. I'd also like to acknowledge that these issues, if not addressed, can in some way become a part of a global issue, at least as it relates to our country. Mr. Chairman, I think that the wildfires are just a small example of what can happen when we ignore climate change. I think we have to do this. I greatly appreciate what the ranking member has brought to our attention. And Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will yield to the gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Green. I just wanted to again emphasize that in my home state of Texas, we have faced 170 confirmed climate disasters, including 7 wildfires caused by severe droughts and extreme heat since 1980, which has exceeded $1 billion in shared losses. As the ranking member pointed out, the Texas Panhandle is suffering from the state's second largest wildfire on record, which is an area of 1 million acres, which is about twice the size of Houston. So this bill could not be coming up at a better time. We really do need to make sure that the insurance companies do not leave our state or decide not to cover any more because the risks are getting larger. So I want to support the ranking member's important effort and know that it's not just about Texas, it's about every state in the country. With that, I yield back to Mr. Green.
In reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman, if I just may add this, the ranking member and I went down to Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina, and there were many persons who owned their homes and could not afford the insurance. As a result, there are still people who haven't recovered from Katrina because of a lack of insurance. And if we don't address this issue, we may find many persons without insurance who own their homes and won't be able to recover if there's a fire. Thank you again.
I thank the gentleman from Texas. Further discussion, further debate. Ms. Kim from California, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
I want to commend Ranking Member Waters for introducing H.R. 7462 to improve data for coverage gap in fire insurance, and I will be supporting the bill. However, let's be clear. Current California state law, specifically Prop 103, has forced insurance companies to stop underwriting new homeowners insurance policies. Furthermore, the state of California and Governor Newsom have been slow to respond to higher home insurance premiums and to major insurance companies exiting the state insurance market. To this day, Sacramento has not changed any policies to strengthen the home and wildfire insurance market. You should know that less competition and players in the insurance market increases premiums and forces people into California's state-run FAIR plan, which is more costly than private insurance plans and provides less coverage. I've talked to so many of my friends and neighbors saying that the cost of insuring home is unbearable and unaffordable. For the first time in decades, California experienced negative population growth in 2021 and 2022. And one Stanford study indicates that 1/3 or more of Californians consider moving due to housing cost alone. In the long run, we know that price controls lead to higher costs and scarcity for consumers. The California state government must come to its senses and implement reforms that improve the viability of the state insurance market for decades to come. I look forward to working with Ranking Member Waters to make housing more affordable in California through market-driven practices. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Mrs. Beatty from Ohio seeks recognition.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to echo the support of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in supporting Ranking Member Waters' Bill Wildfire Insurance Coverage Study Act. I also want to thank you, Mr. Chair, for recognizing, in addition to California, there are many other states. As most of you know, I hail from the Midwest, and we have not been spared by it. Wildfires there, whether it's Missouri, Illinois, and Minnesota, have also been affected. The effects of climate change continues to worsen, and we have seen a significant increase in natural disasters and extreme weather conditions, from floods or hurricanes to excessive heat waves and wildfires. In addition to the physical dangers posed by these conditions, American families also face an incredible financial risk associated with property damage. In some states across the country, segments of the insurance industries are halting new businesses, or in some cases, coverage entirely for certain disaster events like wildfires. This legislation, as we have heard from both sides of the aisle, will help us to better understand the challenges faced by insurers and allow us to chart, I believe, a better path forward that protects American households and our economy as a whole. Again, thank you to all my colleagues, and this is proof, Madam Ranking Member, let the record show that we're going to pass this out of committee and another bill that will be passed on the floor. Thank you, and I yield back.
The lady yields back. There being no further discussion or debate or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentlewoman from California. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of substitute is adopted. The question now occurs on ordering the bill H.R. 7462 as amended, reported the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and a recorded vote has been requested. Yes. A recorded vote is requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, please raise your hands. A sufficient number having raised hands. A recorded vote is ordered pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules. The vote on this question is postponed. With that, as members are coming in, why don't we take, I'd like to announce to members it was my intention that we would be able to do electronic voting that many other committees do in Congress, but we've not come to an agreement between the majority and minority on the procedures for that. The goal here is electronic voting to be faster than the current process, not slower. And so we're still negotiating to ensure that it is faster and that people have confidence that their vote will be recorded, which is a quite important thing. So why don't we recess for 2 minutes, make sure that members can come in, and then we will start votes on bills, starting with HA Res 109. So we'll pause. Welcome back. Members will take their seats. Pursuant to the chair's previous order, we'll now take votes pending on ordering HA Res 109 favorably reported. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hill. Aye. Mr. Hill votes aye. Mr. Lucas. Aye. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Luchtmeyer. Mr. Luchtmeyer votes aye. Mr. Huizinga.
Okay.
Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr votes aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk votes aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney votes aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson votes aye. Mr. Rose. Mr. Rose votes aye. Mr. Stile. Mr. Stile votes aye. Mr. Timmons. Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman votes aye. Mr. Muser. Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Garbarino. Mr. Garbarino votes aye. Mrs. Kim. Mrs. Kim votes aye. Mr. Donalds. Mr. Donalds votes aye. Mr. Flood. Mr. Flood votes aye. Mr. Lawler. Mr. Lawler votes aye. Mr. Nunn. Mr. Nunn votes aye. Ms. De La Cruz. Ms. De La Cruz votes aye. Mrs. Houchin. Mrs. Houchin votes aye. Mr. Ogles. Mr. Ogles votes aye. Ms. Waters.
No.
Ms. Waters votes no. Mrs. Velasquez. Mrs. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Sherman. No. Mr. Sherman votes no. Mr. Meeks. No. Mr. Meeks votes no. Mr. Scott. No. Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Lynch. No. Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver votes no. Mr. Himes. No. Mr. Himes votes no. Mr. Foster. No. Mr. Foster votes no. Mrs. Beatty.
No.
Mrs. Beatty votes no. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas votes no. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Caston. Mr. Caston votes no. Ms. Presley. Ms. Presley votes no. Mr. Horsford. Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Talib. No. Ms. Talib votes no. Mr. Torres.
Aye.
Mr. Torres votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Ms. Williams.
Williams of Georgia votes no.
Ms. Williams votes no. Mr. Nickel.
Aye.
Mr. Nickel votes aye. Ms. Pedersen. Ms. Pedersen votes no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye. Mr. Huizinga. Mr. Huizinga votes aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Green.
Green votes nay.
Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Gonzalez.
Is there a member who has not voted? Any member who wishes to change his or her vote? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 31 and the nays are 20.
Majority having voted in favor of HJ Res 109, the resolution is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to the Chair's previous order, we'll now take votes pending on ordering H.R. 6864 as submitted, favorably reported. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hill. Aye. Mr. Hill votes aye. Mr. Lucas. Aye. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Luchtmeyer. Mr. Luchtmeyer votes aye. Mr. Huizinga. Mr. Huizinga votes aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr votes aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk votes aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney votes aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson votes aye. Mr. Rose. Mr. Rose votes aye. Mr. Stile. Mr. Stile votes aye. Mr. Timmons. Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman votes aye. Mr. Muser. Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Garbarino. Mr. Garbarino votes aye. Mrs. Kim. Mrs. Kim votes aye. Mr. Donalds. Mr. Donalds votes aye. Mr. Flood. Mr. Flood votes aye. Mr. Lawler. Mr. Lawler votes aye. Mr. Nunn. Mr. Nunn votes aye. Ms. De La Cruz. Ms. De La Cruz votes aye. Mrs. Houchin. Mrs. Houchin votes aye. Mr. Ogles. Mr. Ogles votes aye. Ms. Waters.
Aye.
Ms. Waters votes aye. Ms. Velasquez. Aye. Mrs. Velasquez votes aye. Mr. Sherman. Aye. Mr. Sherman votes aye. Mr. Meeks. Aye. Mr. Meeks votes aye. Mr. Scott. Aye. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Lynch. Aye. Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver votes aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes votes aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster votes aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty votes aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas votes aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Caston. Mr. Caston votes aye. Ms. Presley. Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Horsford. Mr. Horsford votes aye. Ms. Talib. Ms. Talib votes aye. Mr. Torres.
Aye.
Mr. Torres votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Williams.
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams votes aye. Mr. Nickel. Mr. Nickel votes aye. Ms. Pedersen. Ms. Pedersen votes aye. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Gonzalez.
Is that Mr. Barr? Is Barr seeking, trying to get the clerk's attention? Very
Mr.
well.
Barr, I have you recorded as voting aye.
Any member wishing to change his or her vote or not recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 50.
A majority having voted in favor of H.R. 6864 as amended, the bill is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The committee will now take the postponed votes on the pending amendment to H.R. 7280, the HUD Transparency Act, offered by the gentlewoman from Texas. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Missouri. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hill. Aye. Mr. Hill votes aye. Mr. Lucas. Aye. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mr. Sessions. Aye. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Luetkemeyer. Mr. Luetkemeyer votes aye. Mr. Huizinga. Aye. Mr. Huizinga votes aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr votes aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk votes aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney votes aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson votes aye. Mr. Rose. Mr. Rose votes aye. Mr. Stile. Mr. Stile votes aye. Mr. Timmons. Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman votes no. Mr. Muser. Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Garbarino. Mr. Garbarino votes aye. Mrs. Kim. Mrs. Kim votes aye. Mr. Donalds. Mr. Donalds votes aye. Mr. Flood. Mr. Flood votes aye. Mr. Lawler. Mr. Lawler votes aye. Mr. Nunn. Mr. Nunn votes aye. Ms. De La Cruz. Ms. De La Cruz votes aye. Mrs. Houchin. Mrs. Houchin votes aye. Mr. Ogles. Mr. Ogles votes no. Ms. Waters.
Aye.
Ms. Waters votes aye. Mrs. Velasquez.
Aye.
Mrs. Velasquez votes aye. Mr. Sherman. Aye. Mr. Sherman votes aye. Mr. Meeks. Aye. Mr. Meeks votes aye. Mr. Scott. Aye. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Lynch. Aye. Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver votes aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes votes aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster votes aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty votes aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas votes aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Caston. Mr. Caston votes aye. Ms. Presley. Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Horsford. Mr. Horsford votes aye. Ms. Talib. Ms. Talib votes aye. Mr. Torres. Mr. Torres votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Williams.
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams votes aye. Mr. Nickel. Mr. Nickel votes aye. Ms. Pedersen. Ms. Pedersen votes aye. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Gonzalez.
Is there any member who hasn't voted or wishes to change his or her vote? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 49 and the nays are 2.
A majority having voted in favor of the amendment is adopted. There being no further discussion or debate on the bill, the question now occurs on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentlewoman from Texas as amended. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on ordering the bill, H.R. 7280, as amended, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Recorded vote being requested. The Vice Chair requests a recorded vote. All those in favor of a recorded vote, please raise your hand. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is ordered. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hill. Aye. Mr. Hill votes aye. Mr. Lucas. Aye. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mr. Sessions. Aye. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer votes aye. Mr. Huizinga. Mr. Huizinga votes aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk votes aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney votes aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson votes aye. Mr. Rose. Mr. Rose votes aye. Mr. Stile. Mr. Stile votes aye. Mr. Timmons. Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman votes aye. Mr. Muser. Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Garbarino. Mr. Garbarino votes aye. Mrs. Kim. Mrs. Kim votes aye. Mr. Donalds. Mr. Donalds votes aye. Mr. Flood. Mr. Flood votes aye. Mr. Lawler. Mr. Lawler votes aye. Mr. Nunn. Mr. Nunn votes aye. Ms. De La Cruz. Ms. De La Cruz votes aye. Mrs. Houchin. Mrs. Houchin votes aye. Mr. Ogles. Mr. Ogles votes aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters votes aye. Mrs. Velasquez. Mrs. Velasquez votes aye. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman votes aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks votes aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver votes aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes votes aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster votes aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty votes aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas votes aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Caston. Mr. Caston votes aye. Ms. Presley. Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Horsford. Mr. Horsford votes aye. Ms. Talib. Ms. Talib votes aye. Mr. Torres. Mr. Torres votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Williams.
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams votes aye. Mr. Nickel. Mr. Nickel votes aye. Ms. Pedersen. Ms. Pedersen votes aye. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr is recorded as voting aye. Mr. Gonzalez.
Any other member wish to change his or her vote or not recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 50.
A majority having voted in favor of H.R. 7280 as amended, the bills are ordered favorably reported to the House, and without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to the chair's previous order, we'll now take the votes pending on ordering H.R. 7156 as amended favorably reported. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer votes aye. Mr. Huizinga. Mr. Huizinga votes aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr votes aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk votes aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney votes aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson votes aye. Mr. Rose. Mr. Rose votes aye. Mr. Stile. Mr. Stile votes aye. Mr. Timmons. Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr.
Actually,
Norman.
Clerk.
Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman votes aye. Mr. Muser. Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Garbarino. Mr. Garbarino votes aye. Mrs. Kim. Mrs. Kim votes aye. Mr. Donalds. Mr. Donalds votes aye. Mr. Flood. Mr. Flood votes aye. Mr. Lawler. Mr. Lawler votes aye. Mr. Nunn. Mr. Nunn votes aye. Ms. De La Cruz. Ms. De La Cruz votes aye. Mrs. Houchin. Mrs. Houchin votes aye. Mr. Ogles. Mr. Ogles votes aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters votes aye. Mrs. Velasquez. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman votes aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks votes aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver votes aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes votes aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster votes aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty votes aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas votes aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Caston. Mr. Caston votes aye. Ms. Presley. Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Horsford. Mr. Horsford votes aye. Ms. Talib. Ms. Talib votes aye. Mr. Torres. Mr. Torres votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Williams.
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams votes aye. Mr. Nickel. Mr. Nickel votes aye. Ms. Pedersen. Ms. Pedersen votes aye. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye. Mr. Emmer. Mrs. Velasquez. Mr. Gonzalez.
Any member wish to change his or her vote or not recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 49 and the nays are 0.
A majority having voted in favor of H.R. 7156 as amended, the bill is ordered favorably reported to the House, and without objection, a motion reconsiders laid on the table. Pursuant to the chair's previous order, we'll now take votes pending on ordering H.R. 7462 as amended favorably reported. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer votes aye. Mr. Huizinga. Mr. Huizinga votes aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr votes aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk votes aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney votes aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson votes aye. Mr. Rose. Mr. Rose votes aye. Mr. Stile. Mr. Stile votes aye. Mr. Timmons. Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman votes no. Mr. Muser. Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Garbarino. Mr. Garbarino votes aye. Mrs. Kim. Mrs. Kim votes aye. Mr. Donalds. Mr. Donalds votes aye. Mr. Flood. Mr. Flood votes aye. Mr. Lawler. Mr. Lawler votes aye. Mr. Nunn. Mr. Nunn votes aye. Ms. De La Cruz. Ms. De La Cruz votes aye. Mrs. Houchin. Mrs. Houchin votes aye. Mr. Ogles. Mr. Ogles votes no. Mrs. Waters. Ms. Waters votes aye. Mrs. Velasquez. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman votes aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks votes aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver votes aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes votes aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster votes aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty votes aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas votes aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Caston. Mr. Caston votes aye. Ms. Presley. Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Horsford. Mr. Horsford votes aye. Ms. Talib. Ms. Talib votes aye. Mr. Torres. Mr. Torres votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Williams.
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams votes aye. Mr. Nickel. Mr. Nickel votes aye. Ms. Pedersen. Ms. Pedersen votes aye. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye. Mr. Emmer. Mrs. Velasquez. Mr. Gonzalez.
Any member wish to change their vote or has not been recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 47 and the nays are 2.
Committee will come to order. Clerk will report again, please.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 47, the nays are 2.
A majority having voted in favor of H.R. 7462 as amended, the bills are ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion reconsiders laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical and conforming changes on all measures ordered to be reported today. Members will have 2 days to file views on each reported measure considered today. There being no further business pending, the committee stands adjourned.